What's up, guys? Hot Noob here, and this is episode 1 of Hot Noob's IT Programming Crash Course, or whatever I may end up renaming or calling this course or series of videos or whatever. Who knows? Anywho, um, in this video, we'll be doing an introduction to web development, the client and server side, and the LAMP workflow. We're mainly just explaining the whys here, and programming will start, or even setting up will start in the next episode. Programming may be in like the third or fourth episode, starting there anyways. So let's get started with this. This is sort of somewhat important. So why are we starting with web development? Well, there's a lot of pros to web development in general. It's multi-platform. You can whatever you program with the web can run on Windows, Linux, Android. You can make websites, apps. You can even make desktop apps with your basic web programming, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that sort of thing. It's multi-use. The languages that you'll be learning will have multiple uses. For example, PHP can be used to make scripts. HTML, like I said, you can actually use them to develop Android apps or whatever, because most devices support a web browser, and most of the time you can embed a web browser into an application and interact with it. So it's got a lot of flexibility. It's been around for a long time. There are some downsides, of course. So one of the main reasons to use it, or why I use it all the time, is it's fast to develop, and you're developing both the server side and the client side with these tools or languages. The libraries are pretty standardized, and a lot of them have been around for a long time, like jQuery. Fast to deploy because, again, it's pretty standardized. You install a Linux VM, you install Apache, MySQL, yada yada, just your basic LAMP stack. And in many cases, you can just use a pre-made image or a VM or whatever. It's really easy to deploy. Many pre-made scripts. So you have lots of scripts like WordPress. You have like PHP, BB. Honestly, I rarely use pre-made scripts, but you have lots of them. So you can get something going and running without actually fully knowing, like, without making things from scratch or whatever. To be honest, you're not going to make anything really amazing if you're using WordPress or PHP, but when you're in a pinch, you can use them. It takes very little time. So what are the cons of web development? Well, you have HTML, and you have all the different web browsers and the mobile browsers, etc. Everything is all slightly different, so you're going to experience a lot of bugs, and you're going to have to do a lot of learning just from experience. Everything is inconsistent. The tag behaviors are different. For example, the body tag. For example, many browsers give it a default padding or margin of more than 0. So if you're just like doing the HTML tag and you see this white border around or whatever, only experience will really tell you that you need to set the margin and body to 0 for the body tag. The code goes obsolete all the time. As some of you may know, we have HTML5, and that's been around, I don't know, like 10 years or whatever. It's been around since I was younger, but a lot of the features are coming and going. Most of them are staying for the most part, but every now and then you're going to lose something. For example, the table tag is depreciated, and it's been depreciated for like 5 years or maybe even 10 years or however long. It's still there. I still use it, and you got to be crazy to depreciate the table tag, because it is a very good stepping stone for learning to program HTML, even though it's basically been replaced by all the features in divs or dividers. So yeah, if you want to use like WordPress, you should expect that in 2 or 3 years it's not going to work, and you're going to have to either update WordPress, update your code to adhere to WordPress, or whatever. Something may change and go obsolete. That is a big problem with it. But you also have that problem with other languages like C++ and C#, although they're more likely to last longer. But you do have to spend a lot more effort programming them. So you could consider this a con, which is that it's open source or a just-in-time compilation, which means everything is stored as text for the most part, and that means anyone can steal your code for the most part. and you can attempt to obfuscate, but if you obfuscate, you're going to really, really take a performance hit, and it's just unfortunate, but because it is ultimately just in time, someone can just hack the obfuscation for the most part, in many cases. It's actually very difficult to do obfuscation, and you actually may just end up paying for some third-party obfuscation if you're really that paranoid and want to throw down the cash. But for the most part, you have to obfuscate it. Or I mean, for the most part, you can try obfuscating, and in my opinion, it's not really worth it in most cases. It's not worth the effort because then you have to also add your obfuscator to your workflow. So when you do releases, and it's just too much work. For the most part, nobody can really program that well, so you're actually pretty safe just not obfuscating stuff. Just-in-time compilation. It's slower. You have like a middleman, and that middleman is taking your text and turning it into computer code or whatever. So in the case of, I say JavaScript or whatever, most browsers these days will actually compile the JavaScript into an intermediate language like or IL, and then it will interpret the intermediate language as it's loading or whatever. That seems to be faster. PHP can be pre-compiled into IL via, I think it's like OP cache or whatever. And once it's in IL, intermediate language, then it gets converted into ASM or assembly or binary or whatever you want to call it. So obviously, all these extra steps compared to, say, if you're to write a native binary, it's just going to be running ASM. So obviously, it's going to be faster, but takes a lot less time to develop. So why LAMP? LAMP is Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. You probably don't even know what that is, or maybe you do because it's pretty common. Well, let's start with the general website app workflow. I have this a bit backwards because normally people think client, web browser, maybe the HTMLs that goes to the server, Apache. It actually goes in reverse. So we're going to start off with our data storage down here. Databases, MySQL, basically your text and data files. This is where you're storing information for the most part on any web application. And then that's going to go to your server scripts, so PHP or ASP.NET. There are a bunch of other ones, but these are just the main players, and for the most part, it's basically just PHP. For the most part, I mean, there is Python and whatever, but PHP is the main contender out there, and PHP is what I teach, what I know, and what you're going to learn. Then it goes to Apache, and then the server OS, Linux or Windows, and that outputs HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and then finally to your client. So what happens is your client connects to a URL, and it talks to all of these, and they output HTML, JavaScript, CSS, yada. I'm going to start by explaining the server scripts portion, PHP. So we have many server-side languages, and these are just scripting languages. Like I said, it's mainly just-in-time compilation. So it's just text files stored on the server, and your server software is calling these text files whenever someone types in the URL or whatever. So you have PHP. What's great about it? It's free, works on Linux, works on Windows, probably works on Apple too. I've never tried. It's well established. It's been around for years, and it's basically what I started to learn on. I learned PHP as soon as I found out about it, when I was like 10 years old or whatever. ASP.NET. This is Microsoft's server-side language, and it's .NET based. Cons, it's expensive. You can only run it on Windows. I know .NET was somewhat moved over to Linux, so Linux can run .NET. So I don't really keep track of ASP.NET, so maybe it's running on Linux these days. It is the industry oddball, and last I really ran into it, mainly only academics or people at university use ASP.NET. You can make your own server because it's a very simple protocol, web server. So you can make it in C++, C#, or whatever language you want to use that can, create webhooks or whatever. And then you have people using Node.js JavaScript's garbage in general. It's inconsistent. It's full of bugs. Just honestly, when Node.js came out, all I could think of was why? 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 It has no place in the server world. Don't even try learning it. It's a waste of time. I can't believe they even teach it in universities. PHP. So this is my main preferred server language or server-side language. And the main role of PHP or the server-side language is to render the HTML, JavaScript, CSS output, maybe images, maybe even video processing. You can execute commands on Windows or Linux. Typically, you're going to develop for Linux, so shell execute, ffmpeg, do some video processing. You can output text, JSON or whatever, basically anything, really. And you can use it for running cron jobs or scripts. So I got a little image here of something that I've made at work before. And here's just a script that the people use there for wiping hard drives or whatever. And, it does what it needs to do. I have the web interface on a website, so this is just the client interface. And you're basically just answering a couple questions before wiping the drives. You can do simple things like that. Any text-based UIs or whatever can be done with PHP relatively easily. So, in not every case, this is why I'm doing it second, we have our databases and MySQL. This is where we store our user data or whatever, anything for long-term storage or even variables or whatever, like your website name, something like that. Who knows what you want to store in. But in general, you have database servers and you have text files. So database servers give you fast, cached, reliable results, and it's pretty standardized, as the names are MySQL, MySQL, varieties of SQL, which is server query language. So it's very standardized. It's easy to work with. For the most part, it doesn't really matter if you use MySQL or MySQL. If you know just plain old SQL, it's just a matter of which has which features. So standard, easy to work with. And then you have text files. Now, text files are typically slow, unreliable, especially for large or complex data sets. And the reason for that is because your database is working hard to balance the memory and your hard drive for you, whereas your text file is almost always going to be on the hard drive, or if you're lucky, on the hard drive cache, if it's something really small. It's not standardized. You're going to probably come up with some weird protocol or whatever, and that's not good if you're developing with other people, or even if you just come back to your code like 10 years later and you're like, what's this weird text data file? Obviously, if you're doing like large pieces of data like images or whatever, like for video games, you might make your own, data files, but for servers, more or less not. It's okay for logs, archives, simple data that's not often used, stuff that you don't need right away. So, yeah. Anyways, your database servers, there's a whole bunch of them. For the most part, you're just going to be using MySQL. And the reason for that, well, it's free, runs on Linux, Unix, Windows, runs on everything. It's fast, reliable, and for the most part, it is the industry standard. And you can use it to make clusters. You can have multiple servers working together to providing the data, and you get into all sorts of complexity there. For example, you got Percona, and I probably spelled that wrong, and Galera. And you have all sorts of variations like MariaDB or whatever. For Linux, you're probably just going to use MariaDB because of all the extra features and whatnot. They forked long ago. Anywho, then you have MS SQL, which is basically just Microsoft's SQL. That's what MS stands for. Problem with it, it's expensive. It only works on Windows. Has typically poor write performance. I mean, I haven't looked up into it in like the past 10 years, but last time I looked at it, poor write performance, and it's an oddball. Usually only academics use MS SQL, and it's usually only good for standalone instances. It doesn't cluster very well. I mean, a lot of that's been changing because it's highly dependent on Windows servers. And I'll explain that later, why Windows servers are horrible to work with. So We've gone over our database storage, and our server scripts are calling data from our database storage and they're outputting stuff. And well, what's actually in between is our server software in most cases, unless you made your own server software or whatever. So the industry standards or most commons is going to be Apache or Nginx or however you pronounce it. So you can do it yourself. The pro is you get good performance. It's good for video games, server side or whatever. You can make your custom protocols. You can encrypt stuff and whatever, and make it much more hard to hack or whatever. But it's probably not going to be HA, not going to have high availability. It's going to be slow to develop. It's going to have lots of bugs because you're creating the server software yourself. So because it's going to have lots of bugs, it's actually potential that it could be hacked very easily. However, you're not likely to be hacked via some automated software. Not likely. Maybe, not likely. Then you have Apache, industry standard, lots of features and support. It's reliable. It is fast to configure, and it updates really fast. It has live config updates like htaccess, so you don't have to restart or reload the server every time you want to update the configuration. And most pre-made scripts are designed for Apache. So WordPress, for example, I don't use pre-mades very often anymore, but you get what the idea. Most are good with Apache because of basically just the live config updates and flexibility. Then you have Ninjix or whatever you want to call it. And for the most part, you're only going to be using this as like a high availability proxy, but then you can use HA proxy, and it's some people have Ninjix ahead of Apache. But yeah, for the most part, it's lightweight, less features. It is harder to use. It is also reliable, but the config updates require you to restart the server software, and there's no HT access. So it's a little bit faster. So it's really only good for like gigantic websites like maybe Google or whatever. Some site that's not going to be updated as much on the configuration level. And it is unfortunately incompatible with most pre-made scripts because it's more difficult to configure. All right, so then we have our server operating system. You can choose between Linux, Windows, maybe even Unix if you're crazy enough. Problem with Windows, it's expensive. You have to pay for licensing fees. It's like $1,000 for a license and per server, and you got to be crazy or an academic to use it. It's unreliable. The updates often break the servers, and when you have a bad update on Windows, you can't fix it. You have to restore a backup, and that's lots and lots of downtime. And then even then, you have to like restore the backup and somehow be like, Windows, please don't update because you're going to crash the server again if you update, and then it updates anyways. So big no-no for reliability. Difficult to cluster. The clustering tools are unfortunately difficult. The tools aren't even meant, like they're not even developed for Windows. They're all developed for Linux. So you're not likely going to have a high availability cluster. You can do it, I think, these days, but that's relatively new and, like I said, expensive. It's mostly GUI, so you're going to be clicking randomly, trying to figure out how to do things, and the documentation is just not going to be there for you. If you're going to look on documentation, it's going to be pictures and click here, click there, instead of type in this one command or whatever. It's really slow to use. It's just a pain. Some things you do have to use Windows for, like a domain controller, and you also have like security problems. Windows is always full of like security bugs and whatnot. Now, in terms of servers getting hacked, it really doesn't matter what you use. Windows, Linux, they all get hacked. Unix, on the other hand, doesn't get hacked that much because, well, there's less in it for the most part. It is highly reliable. They don't update very often, and difficult to use, meaning less people know how to use it, less people know how to hack it. Thus, you get higher security in Unix. However, your updates are often not going to be the most up-to-date, so you're going to use Apache or whatever, and it's going to be like a year-old version or whatever in many cases. Linux, what we're going to be using, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, is free, just like Unix. It's reliable. However, you are going to run into the common Linux bugs, and you'll eventually learn them. It's basically only one or two or whatever. They're easily fixed and common, and if you do happen to get a rare bug, chances are you can just Google and someone's already had it before you. hopefully. Live updates, so you have less downtime, and you actually can control when you install the updates, unlike with Windows, and that's a huge, huge thing for servers. However, like all servers or all computers, you don't update, well, you're likely to be vulnerable to hacking with enough time. Lightweight, and you can run it headless CLI, which is pretty standard. That'll save you on a little bit of processing time. It'll save money in the long run, especially if you have to do a larger scale or have lots of servers or clusters or whatever. You can run it basically on anything as well, which is great. It's easy to use once you learn how to use Linux, and all the features to create clusters and cloud and whatever you want to call it, all that sort of thing, high availability, all of that exists on Linux. It's free, and you're good to go, really. Has everything you need. All the tools are developed there. Now, for the Linux distros or distributions or flavors, there's tons and tons of them. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of the main ones. First, there's Ubuntu, or however you want to pronounce it. And this is, for the most part, the standard. Only recently has it actually gotten like really, really good for server usage just because of the popularity or whatever, and it's becoming more and more stable, which is great. There's tons and tons of documentation. You just Google and someone's already had the problem before you. And I mean, I've never had to do it myself, but you could theoretically pay Ubuntu to like help you. But my experience with paid support, never do it. It's always a waste of money, almost always. And I'm usually always just like reporting a bug to them if that, so, and then they something on their end usually. Anyways, it's secure enough. You just keep your servers up to date and you're more or less fine. There's problems with the updating, of course, which is you have to keep your scripts up to date, because if they update something and they change something in, say, like PHP, well, now you have to reprogram a little bit. But that rarely happens for the most part, thankfully. It's fast to set up. I mean, most distros are fast to set up, but generally I find the Ubuntu setup screen very simple, straightforward. And the LTS 2-year cycle is good. You want longer cycles because you don't want to reinstall and reset up everything every year. With LTS, you can set it up every 4 years or so. They have a 2-year cycle, and then typically I do every 4 years. I'll go into that more later on. You can do Debian, which is actually the base for Ubuntu, and it's the vanilla. Pretty much everything that you install on Ubuntu will also install on Debian, and vice versa to a degree. They're different dependencies or whatever. So the documentation is mostly geared towards Ubuntu because more people use it. And honestly, I like the Ubuntu desktop experience a little bit better than Debian. Unfortunately, it has a shorter release cycle, so you have to deal with more updates, and that's more of a hassle. More updates can be quite the pain. So typically the release cycle goes Debian, they test it out on Debian, and then it goes to Ubuntu, typically. I mean, some things don't go that route, but anyways. Then there's CentOS and Red Hat, and CentOS is basically just an older version of Red Hat, and well, that has its own problems. Slower to updates, and the documentation is poor, and if you want support or help or whatever, trying to fix something out, you sometimes have to pay them to help you. It's difficult to do things because everyone is used to the other Linux distributions. However, it is more secure because, well, money's backing it up for the most part, because it's all based on Red Hat for the most part. However, you'll run into other issues, which is that the vast majority of people or IT people out there don't know how to use CentOS, and most things are meant for Debian or Ubuntu or whatever, something Debian based. Overall, you never want to use any distribution that is less than 1 year old. The reason for that is because it's going to be full of bugs. Just like with Windows, you don't want to update to Windows on the first year because it's going to be full of bugs, and you might end up having to lose your computer and reinstall it or brick it or whatever. So as a general rule of thumb, wait at least a year before upgrading or updating or using the latest version. Then you can do it every 4 years instead of every 2 years or whatever. So for example, about now you can start using Ubuntu 20, and that's because it came out in 2020, and all of the software has been updated so it runs on Ubuntu 20, so Apache or whatever. Within the first year, Apache often is actually very buggy or it doesn't even work at all on the new distribution, so that's something else to keep in mind. Just wait a year. Ubuntu 22, when it comes out in 2022, which is next year, you should wait till the 2023 or even 2024 before you start using it, especially in a production environment. Okay, we've gone over server operating systems. Now let's go into HTML or JavaScript, CSS, the output, what your server is sending to the client. So HTML, JavaScript, CSS, it's for the most part all the same thing. It's all HTML. HTML5 is HTML. You don't have to think of them as separate languages because it's all used at the same time or whatever. It's what the browsers process. That's basically it. I'm not going to go too much further into it. We can learn that later, what it is exactly. JavaScript, which is JS, that's the client-side language. This is what does your dynamic content on a web browser. It's how you can say alert hello or make buttons do stuff that isn't a part of HTML. And it's kind of hard to explain if you don't program in JavaScript or program websites at all anyways. It's contained to the browser, so it's mostly secure. You usually cannot use JavaScript to access something like local files on a computer. There are some local store file things on different browsers, but for the most part, it's secure for the client and the users. You don't have to worry about viruses or whatever. It's designed so that it's contained within the browser. JavaScript interacts with HTML or style sheets or CSS to display data and create your general user experience. You can create websites without JavaScript. It is very much doable, but you'll find that you'll be lacking a little bit of a spark and it might seem a little bit out of dated or something. So you'll probably want to learn JavaScript. Then you have these like more weird features or less often used like C#. I mentioned C# because if you're going to be making a game in Unity, well, you can embed C# into the browser these days or whatever, and that's how you can get Unity to work on a web. So you can make games in Unity for browsers and whatnot because it does it in C# for the most part. Last I checked anyways. Then you have your older ActiveX, which is depreciated, and Flash, which is, long depreciated, and Flash was notorious for viruses, being full of bugs and worms and whatnot. It wasn't really designed for what they ended up using it for, so whatever. So these are very dynamic languages. Like I said, Unity can make video games with it, and you're basically, in the case of C#, you're running intermediate language or IL code on the user's computer. I'm not sure what sort of extra security features they have put in place, but they are potentially causing security risks. So you could get a virus or something if someone was malicious. All right, the client, the web browser. So your web browser renders all the HTML and JavaScript output. And your JavaScript, does dynamic things or whatever. In the background, you can quite often have requests going on, or your connections are downloading more and more stuff. Like the browser quite often just doesn't sit there and do nothing or wait for your input or whatever. Usually it's doing something in the background if you're creating a dynamic website. So we have Ajax or WebSockets. WebSockets is more HTML5. Ajax is asynchronous JavaScript and XML, but really in this day and age, it should be called something else. All you're doing is creating a new URL request, and you're loading that data in a script, and you're processing that data however you see fit. So you can make requests and you can just get text. The problem is it's non-standardized. It's custom. You're going to be making your custom processors, and well, it's great because it's raw text. You can do it fairly easily or whatever. However, you can take it one step further, and then you can use JSON, which is a standardized I don't know how to explain it, markup language or whatever you want to call it. It's great because basically every language out there has JSON these days. So you can use C#, you can use JavaScript or whatever you want to parse the JSON. You can use PHP. You can even make your own parser fairly easily. It's really straightforward, simple, and you're just sending arrays or objects or whatever in the form of JSON. Maybe even classes, but it's really just objects. It's a great way to transfer data. We'll go over that later in the future. Then you have XML, which is the old way. And I think this more comes from Microsoft when they were, the main programmers out there or whatever. And XML, it's a bit of a pain to use. The implementations for XML are not really standard. There's a lot of features in XML that they try to put in that you kind of don't really need. You can kind of achieve with JSON. And it is bulkier and slower to process or parse or whatever to load in. So it has its downsides. For the most part, XML is the old way of doing it, but a lot of things still use XML. And XML, if you don't know, just looks like HTML. All right, so that's basically it for your introduction to LAMP. It's quite the crash course. In the next video, we will be setting up probably XAMPP or so, a development area, so you can start seeing what I'm talking about here. Anywho, guys, this is Hot Noob here. This is the Hot Noob IT channel. I also have a main channel, youtube.com/hotnoob. Please subscribe.